I have two announcements. At the end of the presentation, there'll be a question and answer period. If you'd like to learn more about the stained glass windows or the basilica or the statues, just feel free to ask anything that comes to your mind. And Susan and John and I will be at the visitor's desk at the front or the back, whichever way you think about it. There are Christmas ornaments, cards, books, stocking stuffers, and gifts that are inspired by our stained glass windows. And that supports the work of the Basilica Heritage Foundation. The other thing you might like to know is that on Saturdays and Sundays from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. from now until December 19th, the Basilica Cathedral Museum, which is in the Pastoral Center just to the west, we have a display called Away in a Manger. It's nativity scenes from around the world, and we put it up every year except during COVID, so we're reopening this year. Admission is by timed entry. Just feel free to call the Basilica and make a reservation to come in, or you can actually come to the door and we'll just do the Vax Pass there. All the COVID protocols apply, so just call the Basilica desk, or you can take your chance and come over and we'll make sure that you get in.
Well, that's great. Thank you. Just to add one thing in about the nativities, another plug, there's almost 150 of them on display, and the library looks fantastic when you come and visit it. This began with the late Larry Dowie and his friends and people who, from many of the churches in St. John's and people from abroad, have donated nativity sets. So it's quite a remarkable collection, and we didn't get to open it last year because of COVID, so we think we can do so safely this year. So we're gonna proceed. Okay, well that's great.
Okay.
Susan.
The most recent restoration work on the Basilica's stained glass windows began in 2018. And since then, we've learned some amazing things about these historic windows.
The first thing we learned is that no two windows are exactly the same size. The Basilica has 63 windows, of which 28 are those large clerestory windows that you see up there. They date from between 1857 and 1905, but no two of them are exactly the same size. So all of them are slightly different.
We learned this when we restored the St. Joseph with the Christ Jesus window and the Annunciation window in 2018. What this means for the restoration is that every exterior wooden storm window will also be of a different bespoke measurement as well.
These are not the kind of windows that you'd be able to go to Home Depot and say, I'll have 28 arch-shaped windows, 7 feet wide by 18 feet tall, please. They all have to be made uniquely, and they have to be authentic, and repairs have to be made using original materials. The exterior windows are made of oak, the storm windows, and they have to be maintained with putty and linseed oil and glazing. So this is a National Historic Site, and we abide by something called Standards and Guidelines for the Conservation of Historic Places in Canada. And it guarantees the authenticity of what people are seeing.
The second thing we learned is that the Basilica has the world's largest collection under one roof of the mid-20th century Irish arts and crafts stained glass windows.
On the 4th of May, 2015, the Minister of State of the Government of Ireland for the Diaspora, Jimmy Deanahan, walked in the front door of the Basilica and asked to see the stained glass windows in the side aisles or the ambulatories. We have 35 of them. And he told us that research from the National Gallery of Ireland had shown that our collection of windows in these ambulatories were all the work of the famous Irish stained glass artist Gerard Early.
So the early families, stained glass is renowned in Ireland and throughout Europe. Gerard Early's grandfather worked with and for an architect you might have heard of, Augustus Welby Pugin, on many of the neo-Gothic buildings of the mid-1800s in London and also around Ireland.
By the mid-1900s, Gerard Early and his studio were producing striking windows in the arts and crafts style, characterized by square and diamond and blown glass patterns.
So in 2015, he walks into the Basilica, Mr. Minister does, and into the Marian Chapel, and then he tweeted to Irish Design 2015 that he was exploring the largest collection of Irish arts and crafts stained glass windows in North America in Newfoundland. And then, on the 8th of October 2018, after the Irish government changed, the new Minister for the Diaspora, Kieran Cannon, visited the Basilica and looked at the windows. And his people tweeted about these windows to the National Gallery of Ireland's 54,000 Twitter followers, and then the Dublin City Art Gallery's 50,000 Twitter followers. So these are well known.
So the other thing we found out that day, Archbishop Curry noticed that he really was struck, the minister was really struck by the organ, and asked him what would he know about the organ. And he said, well, I play sometimes when I'm home in my parish. And so the minister sat down and played for us, which was just wonderful.
The third thing we learned from the restoration of the windows was the identity of one of the most interesting families of donors of stained glass windows in the Basilica.
Don't be offended if you're a doctor, but they weren't doctors.
They weren't lawyers or members of the clergy.
And they weren't teachers or fish merchants.
Which leaves, of course, one alternative. They were the family of the owner of the local pub. Richard Ivory, known to his friends as Dickie Ivory. In particular, it was his wife Johanna Ivory and his business partner William Walsh who made these donations in his memory. Ivory lived from 1810 to 1882. Walsh lived from 1818 to 1892. If you'll look in this picture, I'll just get out of your way, I think that that's Dickie Ivory. That's the door of his pub. That's the Hungry Heart Cafe today.
Wow. So Ivory's family, as far as we know, but we're still learning about this, they donated in his memory 3 windows on the west side of the nave. So they'd be the first 3 there. They're the patron saints of Ireland, St. Columba, St. Bridget, and St. Patrick. So the 3 patrons of Ireland. Coincidentally, or maybe not, they're also buried in the same grave in Northern Ireland at Downpatrick. So also, the Ivorys donated the window of the crucifixion, and they may have donated the window of the resurrection. So 5 huge windows from one family.
We found out about Dickie Ivory a number of years ago. I used to play the organ at 7 o'clock Sunday night Mass here, and one of the people who went to that Mass was a man named John Pius Mulcahy. Some of you might remember him. He was a magistrate. And in the 1980s, he was in his mid-80s, and he told me one evening he remembered being told by his mother when he was a young child, upon asking where a certain person was seated in this church, he was told by his mother that they were sitting right there under Dickie Ivory.
So in 1891, the Daily Colonist newspaper, and on the 31st of October, 1892, the Evening Herald newspaper, described these windows. Ivory and Walsh were both proud Irish emigrants to Newfoundland from County Kilkenny, Ireland, and they both would have known Bishop Fleming very well.
As I said about Dickie Ivory's pub, it was located on the cross, on Rollins Cross. And I just want to draw your attention to this photograph because this is part of the fun of doing this restoration. You get led down all these paths, these different bits and pieces. This is a photograph from an album of photographs by the Newfoundland photographer Simeon Parsons, taken in 1878. And it was taken to document this bow arch and the one right behind it in front of the cathedral there. There were about 12 bow arches put throughout the city, and they were done to welcome the visit to Newfoundland of the papal nuncio, the apostolic delegate to Newfoundland, another Irishman named George Conroy. It might not look like it here, but Dickie Ivory was probably one of the most prosperous and generous parishioners in this congregation, and his pub, just to remind you, was perfectly situated halfway between the sacred and that house of great profanity, the House of Assembly, down on Colonial, the Colonial building. So his house was the local for both. So that's where the money came from.
The fourth thing that we learned is that there were actually mistakes in several of the basilica's stained glass windows. In one case, the mistakes have been there for 133 years.
We became aware of this when the windows were rephotographed by Robert Young, who I see here with me, and for the book that he and I did in 2018 on the stained glass windows.
In September of 1888, 2 new stained glass windows arrived in St. John's. The Evening Herald newspaper for the 1st of September in 1888 noted their arrival.
The usual and safest method for shipping stained glass windows back in that day from Europe to Newfoundland was in a barrel filled with not rum, but molasses. When they arrived, they just washed the molasses off, and voila, they had tasty windows.
Tasty windows. A shameless plug here, I cannot leave this slide without reminding you more details about the windows are told in Susan's fantastic book and in Robert's and my book about the windows, and these books make excellent Christmas gifts. Thank you very much. And here's where it really gets interesting. It seems that the Melchizedek and the Nativity windows, which were by this artist named Louis Lichtenheld Koch of Beauvais, France, were both installed at the same time in this building. In fact, they were almost installed overnight.
And if you look closely at both of the windows, you'll find that there are complementary mistakes.
If you look at the Melchizedek window, an angel's right wing and hand are materializing out of thin air right next to Melchizedek's right ear.
And if you look at the Nativity window, installed at the same time as the Melchizedek window, the angel on the left is missing a right wing.
And if you were to look at the foot of the baby Jesus lying in the manger in the Nativity window, there is a strange thing in the stable at Bethlehem. There is a bishop's mitre, a bishop's hat looking for all the world like Melchizedek's high priest's hat from being the high priest of Israel.
So in fact, 2 panels from Melchizedek and 2 panels from the Nativity were swapped at the time of installation.
And since we have no record of any later work being done on these windows, this leads us to think that they've been like this from the time of their installation.
Back to my favorite picture. So what maybe really happened is that the 2 fellas putting these windows in the cathedral did so after the last Mass one evening, or after the cathedral fell silent on an August or September evening. And maybe they stopped off at Dickie Ivory's shebeen or pub for a pint before coming here to do the work, and then in the fading gloom of the light, they got mixed up and the panels got confused.
So the real question is now, when these windows are restored, should the windows be fixed and put the panels in their intended places, or should they be put back exactly as they are now? Well, the answer is that they get kept as they are now because their story has become part of the history of the Basilica windows.
There's another interesting mistake in the Basilica's stained glass windows, and no less than someone from the Vatican had to point it out to us.
The Paleum Window commemorates the creation of Michael Francis Howley as the first Archbishop of Newfoundland and shows his coat of arms along with
Those of the three suffragan dioceses, St. George's on the west coast with the cross of St. George, and the Immaculate Conception coat of arms of Harbour Grace Diocese. And there's a picture from the lower, here's a picture from the lower part of the Paleum window showing the coat of arms of those three dioceses.
Look carefully at the inscription on the Harbour Grace coat of arms. It's from a verse of one of the 5 antiphons of the Psalms of the second Vespers for the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. The first verse in Latin is,
It's Tota pulchra es Maria, et macula originalis non est in te.
which in English is, "You are all beautiful, Maria, and the stain of original sin is not in you."
So here's what that verse actually sounds like, just so you can hear the hymn. Maybe.
Now, but take another look. This window doesn't say tota pulchra. It says iota pulchra. That's right, an iota. As in, like saying, John, you haven't got an iota. We all know what that means. Meaning, oh, Mary, you are only a tiny bit beautiful. How did we learn this? Much to my great embarrassment, personally and professionally, it was pointed out at another pallium ceremony by none other than His Excellency Archbishop Luigi Bonazzi, the Apostolic Nuncio of Pope Francis to Canada.
Just what you need is the papal nuncio to point out your mistakes. So Archbishop Bonazzi imposed the pallium on Archbishop Hunt on the 12th of September in 2019. The day before that, John had the misfortune to give him a tour.
So, first of all, he visited the gathering place and met the leaders of the Presentation and Mercy congregations and Joanne Thompson, who's now our MP.
He visited Presentation Convent and admired the Veiled Virgin.
We had a hard time actually getting him away from the exceptional hospitality of the Presentation Sisters. And then he hit Signal Hill.
He really wanted to climb the Basilica Towers. So what do you say, even though you know that's dangerous, what do you say when the Pope's representative says, I want to climb those stairs? He wants to inspect a papal basilica. You just say, right this way, Your Excellency. How's our insurance?
How's the insurance? And, you know, he even wanted to ring the bell. So we ended up in the organ loft next to the Paleum window, where, of course, he pointed out this grave error to me, in all seriousness, and, of course, held me personally responsible for this.
So how did tota become iota? We figure most likely when the Paleum stained glass window was restored in the early 2000s, the panels were removed and the painting, like the lettering, was repaired. So at that time, the artist found a panel which read iota because the paint had delaminated from the glass due to thermal shock, and he didn't know that it was supposed to be tota and not iota.
So the next time the stained glass guy is back, and that's Brendan Blackmore of Sunhound Glassworks, that text is going to get restored because the papal nuncio told me to do it or get fired. So.
When the Basilica Foundation first learned the extent of the weakness of the stained glass windows, and particularly the outer storm windows, many of which have dry rot, the first thing we did was secure and reinforce the storm windows with steel bracing, anchored into the mortar joints of the stone of the Dublin granite outer window arches.
In the process of doing that work, 2 of the workers were aloft on a boom lift on the back of the basilica, inspecting the windows of the apse behind the high altar behind me.
And in the westernmost window, so that's the one furthest to the left, on the outside of a piece of stained glass, and the window is, in fact, it has 3 saints in it, but the one that we're looking at is the window, the part of the window that depicts St. Simon. This etching was found. And it says, Thomas Wright, glazier, Snettisham, 1846.
So Thomas Wright was a stained glass artist known to practice in Leeds, England. Snettisham was a hamlet near the town of King's Lynn in the English county of Norfolk. It is very likely that this piece of glass was originally in one of Wright's windows at Snettisham.
And our window, which shows St. Simon, St. James the Less, and St. Matthew, was created for the basilica by the famous English stained glass maker William Warrington. Now, Warrington's work is found in the Palace of Westminster, the British Parliament, in Ely Cathedral, and in St. George's Chapel, Windsor, which is probably the place where you find most of Warrington's work.
Here in the basilica, we have not 1, but 7 large Warrington windows. We have the 5 in the apse behind the altar here. We have the center ones in each of the side galleries.
And next door, Presentation Convent has 2 in the Oratory Chapel, where the Veiled Virgin is, and 3 lights in a window in the hallway. In other words, here at this complex, we have the largest collection of Warrington windows in the Western Hemisphere, all remarkably in the medieval English neo-Gothic style for this, an Irish neoclassical cathedral. And when Warrington got the commission from Bishop Mullock to do the windows for this cathedral, it was a huge commission. He needed to find a lot of glass quickly, wherever it could be found.
So back to poor Thomas Wright. At least one of his windows got taken apart and reused in bits by Warrington to build our windows here.
So we are constantly hearing new things, and we have 2 new discoveries to tell you about this evening.
So over in the storage rooms behind the Episcopal Library, for years, there's been stored this panel, a fragment of a stained glass window. The inscription on it reads, commemorating the consecration of Archbishop Roach, June 29, 1915. In fact, it's the lower quarter of a window, the bottom sash of a stained glass window that would sit above it.
But until this past summer, we had no idea what the rest of that window might have looked like.
Back in 1991, as a student, I had a chat with the late W.J. Ryan, Bill Ryan, the architect, about the architectural history of the Basilica. And he told me that in 1954, when the renovations were underway for the 100th anniversary of the Basilica, the cathedral's administrator, Monsignor Summers, as well as Archbishop Skinner, commissioned the painting of the cathedral and the creation of the 35 arts and crafts stained glass windows around the ambulatories. And they were done, as we've said, were done by Gerard Early in Dublin. But the problem was there were already a couple of stained glass windows in these ambulatories. So Summers and Skinner had them removed to make way for the new full set of the early Irish windows.
So what did those older windows that were removed in 1954 look like? There are no photographs. So in the absence of photographs, we don't know for sure. Is the Archbishop Roche window sash a part of one of them?
But then we made a remarkable discovery this past summer.
One of our tech guys, Ryan Hayward, texted me one evening to say that these windows were being sold on Facebook. So I went online and I found them, and I immediately recognized that they had the same surrounding pattern, if you see the light coming through them there,
So,
that the fragment of the window was that we had in storage.
So what does John do? Hops into the truck and heads off to the man who was selling them out of his garage over on Roche's Line.
And while he had already sold one of the windows, he had 3, to someone nearby, through the generosity of a donor, this foundation was able to acquire the 2 remaining ones that he had, which were St. Francis of Assisi and St. John the Baptist. Of these, the surrounding of St. John the Baptist matches the style of the Archbishop Roche's sash under the window. And I'll just go back to that. You can see you can see this sort of surround here. The light is not great, but it does match. So the man on Roche's Line told me that he had had them for about 10 or 15 years, and he bought them from a man who was in the painting business and had them stored in his warehouse for decades. So this leaves you wondering, if those were the 2, what was the 3rd window? And of course, it was the most gorgeous window of all, St. Bridget. But we don't own that window.
So we had Brendan Blackmore of Sunhound Glassworks examine these windows. He has done the restoration of the other windows in the Basilica, and he thinks they were the work of the McCausland Studios of Toronto, done in about 1915. And again, they're in the arts and crafts style.
So while we don't know exactly where in the Basilica complex they came from, we do know several things. They're not from the Episcopal Library, because those windows are in a different style again.
They're not from the Marian Chapel, because the Marian Chapel didn't exist in 1915.
They could be from the old palace next to the Basilica, which burned in 1919, except there's no indication of smoke or fire damage to these windows. And because the old chapel was a relatively small building, about half the size of the new palace, there since 1923, so it is not likely there was a chapel in the old palace big enough to hold 3 windows.
So the most likely place that these windows came from in the Basilica complex was the Basilica itself, and these were the windows, or some of the windows, that were removed in 1954. So now at least 2 of them are home.
So we hope to find a potential donor to have them restored and then incorporate them into an interpretation of our stained glass history. And with the help of a potential donor, we also hope to convince the owner to let us take St. Bridget home.
And so we arrive at the story of the Solstices. In 2018, while we were doing all the research for the stained glass book, I remembered what Magistrate Mulcahy had told me about Dickie Ivory, and that he used to sit in under what eventually became the windows dedicated in his memory. And we already knew that the earliest windows to appear in the Basilica were those 5 Warrington windows up top. They were installed in 1857 by Bishop Mullock. And this, of course, led to the question, why were they put there? Because we looked at this and said, they're in the apse. Why weren't they put somewhere else in the Basilica? The first thing we did, we had Robert look at them, and there's a whole story about, which I won't get into here, about using a drone in the Basilica with a camera on it and the drone lost the network connection. And Father Cecil may not know this, but it bounced off the ceiling, and then it nearly flew through one of the windows, causing chest pains and a visit to the health. No, it was fine. But we were terrified. But once we got good images of these windows, thanks to Robert, it became clear that their subject matter was not just the couple that you saw, St. Simon and the other, but it was in fact the apostles and the Holy Family. Why did Bishop Mullock put those windows there? And I remembered something else. I remembered that when I was playing the organ at Mass one evening in June, back in the late 1980s, I was sitting in the organ loft, and I saw the sun setting through the center window over the sanctuary organ in the other end of the basilica. So I was up there looking that way. And I wondered, could that be? I thought that was around, the 24th of June, the Feast of John the Baptist. Why would I be up there in the evening? Because I think there was probably a big mass or something. So I emailed Randy Dodge, who was the head of computing at Memorial University. He's also the head of the St. John's chapter of the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada. And I asked him, if you stood in a certain part of St. John's on, say, the winter solstice, and in the same place on the summer solstice, where would the sun rise on December 21st, the shortest day of daylight of the year, and where would the sun set on June 21st, the longest day of daylight in the year? And he asked me, he said, well, where would you be standing in St. John's? And I said, on the front steps of the basilica. So he sent me this map. And it shows that on the winter solstice, the sun rises almost directly in front of the basilica and sets somewhere out through the corner there. And on the summer solstice, the map shows that the sun rises, if I can get this correct. Now I have to point in the right place. It rises in the east, and it goes through the whole of the sky till it sets directly through the center windows in the back. So, he also said this would not have changed very much in the 170 or so years since the basilica was built. So, of course, we had to see this for ourselves. We had to get into the basilica before 8 a.m. on the 21st of December to see what sunrise on the winter solstice looks like, and then to be here after 8 p.m. on the 21st of June to watch sunset at the summer solstice. So this is what sunrise on the winter solstice looks like, and as seen looking at the organ loft. And this is a series of shots showing the sequence of sunset on the summer solstice, which means that before this cathedral was built, Bishop Fleming got up on the barrens with his pins on the solstices a few years before he even dug the hole to lay down the foundations here in 1837, and he laid out where he wanted this church to go. And that means that you are sitting in Newfoundland's New Grange, or maybe a latter-day Stonehenge, but that would be pagan, wouldn't it? Well, Stonehenge and New Grange are pagan, and the story would end there, except that this solstitial axis has direct implications for telling us what we are looking at in this cathedral. And it's more than just stained glass windows. Because we haven't answered the question for you of why Bishop Fleming and Bishop Mullock laid out this cathedral and put the first stained glass windows in the apse so that on the sunset, the summer solstice sets through the apostles' windows.
The answer is found in the medieval Catholic Basilica Cathedral of Chartres in France, the one with the acres of stained glass, the World Heritage Site. In that cathedral, the sun on the summer solstice also sets through its apostles' windows in its apse. In every cathedral, everything has a symbol, a reason, a purpose.
And at Chartres, the setting of the sun on the longest day of sunlight of the year symbolizes the fullness of time, the end of time. The going down of the sun symbolizes the last judgment.
And shining through those windows, the sun points at something. At the last judgment, when we all go through the pearly gates, what question are we going to be asked? We're going to be asked how we might have lived our lives like one of the apostles. So why was the basilica built on this axis of a solstice? Chartres, which was built from 1194 to 1220, was not the only Christian church built on this axis. And according to Professor Duncan Stroik, who is a professor of architecture at the University of Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana, the Basilica of St. Francis of Assisi, built over the tomb of the founder of the Franciscan order, St. Francis, between 1228 and 1253, was also built on a solstitial axis. And St. Peter's, the Vatican, was also built over 120 years. We think 14 years is long to build this. They took 120 years to build that, between 1506 and 1626 on a solstitial axis.
So right there lies the clue to reading our Basilica Cathedral in its authentic historical context. This church was designed and built by a Franciscan, Bishop Fleming. Now, Fleming's alter ego is sitting here too, so I'm conscious now that I'm talking.
Paul Rowe, the actor.
So Fleming and his successor, Mulloch, who was another Franciscan, they decorated, they elaborated, and embellished this basilica. This is a Franciscan church. Our first 5 bishops were Franciscans. It's inspired by the iconography and the charism of St. Francis and the Order of the Franciscans. So we see St. Francis in one of our stained glass windows, and right next to him, the Nativity, depicted in stained glass. This is significant here, because Francis had a tremendous fascination with the Nativity. He read it as one of God's greatest gifts to us, the Incarnation. And you might recall that the Nativity scene, as we know it today, comes from St. Francis of Assisi. So a man dressed as Joseph, a woman as Mary, a baby as the baby Jesus, and lambs and shepherds and magi. But those 2 windows in the basilica are placed right next to each other on purpose, we think.
And in this church, it didn't stop there with the windows. The Nativity Bambino, or baby Jesus, ordered by Bishop Mulloch, was this 300-pound statue in marble of the baby Jesus carved by the Italian sculptor Filippo Gersi. Like the one in the Vatican, it's too heavy to carry in a procession, so the bishop unveiled it with a silk cloth during midnight mass. Today you can see that on permanent display over in the Pastoral Center outside the Nativities exhibit in the Episcopal Library.
As Professor Stroik points out in his lecture, Francis Rebuild My Church, the Franciscan Tradition of Sacred Architecture, a seminar given to the Franciscan University of Steubenville in Ohio, and this talk is available on YouTube. In St. Francis's charism, he read all of nature as pointing to the hand of God and his creation. The summit of that creation was his gift of Christ, his Son, the Incarnation. So Francis taught that everything in a church had to reflect that creation on earth and in heaven.
To achieve that by Fleming and Mulloch's time, the ideal was classical architecture with its acanthus leaves and egg and dart and the images of heaven and earth, and the cherubs in the pendant drop of the ceiling, and in the Corinthian capitals, and the images of the saints.
That also meant depicting here repeatedly, as in all Franciscan churches, the dogma of the Immaculate Conception. So we have a wonderful statue outside of the Immaculate Conception by Irishman John Edward Carew, who worked in London. We have the statue by Italian sculptor Filippo Gersi inside, and a large stained glass window by the German Louis Lichten
That's a mouthful.
Koch, who worked in France, located in the West Gallery of the transept, and another window by the Irishman Gerald Early in the Marian Chapel.
So this is a Franciscan church because, as Bishop Howley wrote in the Evening Telegram Christmas number of 1885, which, by the way, is lost, but exists one copy in a private collection in this town, Bishop Fleming placed the coat of arms of the Franciscan order on a marble plaque and placed it in the front porch of this church over the front door that's on the right, the westernmost front door. We think it's actually still buried there in under the plaster of the wall inside the porch. This is also a Franciscan church because on one of the dice or pedestals that the original high altar, the altar table rested on, which is up now where the chair of the presider is, those three green chairs, that features Bishop Mullock's coat of arms, which has the coat of arms of the Franciscans. If you want to see it even closer, you're right under Jerry Squires' memorial plaque to Bishop Lambert. He put it into the Celtic cross when he was commissioned in 2005. And for further proof that this was built as a Franciscan church, the first and greatest Franciscan church in the New World was the Basilica of St. Francis of Assisi in Assisi, Italy. It has a rose window, and at each corner of the rose window, there's a statue or symbol of one of the four evangelists, highlighting what for Francis of Assisi was the principal importance of the evangelists, the Gospels.
So one of the things we don't have is a rose window, but we do have a great rose with the four evangelists at each corner, just like at Assisi. So look up.
In order of completion, first, the statues of the evangelists were put in, but the first ceiling put in this basilica was flat and white, no great rose. That was installed under Bishop Mullock in about 1852-53, and it remained until the 20th century.
In 1903 to 1905, when Bishop Howley was preparing the cathedral for its 50th anniversary, he designed the Great Rose, and he worked with the Conway family of plasterers, with painter and sculptor Dan Carroll, and with the architect Jonas Barter.
And finally, in 1954-55, this ceiling was painted and polychromed by a guy named Leif Neandros. And I used to get his name confused and call him Leif Neanderthal, but that was unfair. And he worked for the Rambush Decorating Company of New York. And he previously had painted camouflage for the U.S. military in World War II.
Here, Neandros painted the symbols of the Virgin Mary from the Litany of Loretto into the ceiling, fulfilling the Marian symbolism found in a Franciscan church. I'd suggest you go online and have a look at the Heritage Moment videos that we've put up on the Basilica Heritage Foundation website. So many things in this cathedral relate back to its Franciscan architectural heritage.
Even the room we now use as the broadcasting booth for the Basilica for its daily Mass live stream, over there with the two hoops, was the original 1853 Franciscan cloister.
So, we want to thank you very much for coming here this evening. We hope you've enjoyed yourself as much as we've enjoyed learning all sorts of things about our Basilica and reporting on our research and findings and sharing them with you.
We would be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
So yeah, if you do have any questions,
Olo?
yeah.
I think it was local people here. That would have been really expensive.
But what's really funny was, well, funny to us, was how they were shipped. So usually when children come in here for a tour, I'll say, how do you think those windows got here? And they'll say, well, they had to come on a plane. Well, think now, it's 1857. Oh. So they'll figure out on a ship, and then it's, well, how did you keep them from breaking? And they'll say, well, bubble wrap. Or they might say something else, but bubble wrap is usually the big one. And eventually when you say, no, they came in barrels of molasses with a cartoon that showed the installers how it was supposed to look, they get amazed, right? Well, and I get amazed every time I tell the story. I want to figure out who's the person who sprayed off all the molasses. But anyway. Or licked it off.
Licked it off.
I hope not. Do you have any other questions?
Mona.
Yeah, Mona.
So what's the plan for the whole, to restore them all? I'm assuming it's going to be years, but tell us a little more about that.
So early in the 2000s, they did restore the stained glass windows in the organ loft, and then they also did the stained glass in the apse. So there are 8 windows done. We did 2 more of the big ones, so that's 10, and there are 28 large windows. So we have 18 to go. They will get done one way or the other. Glass, as it has been explained to me, is not a solid, it's a liquid, and over time it assumes the form of a drop of water. It sags over 170 years. Additionally, in these windows, they're held together by lead caming. And if you were to look at it vertically, it looks like the black lines. If you were to look at it in profile, it looks like the letter H. So a piece of glass fits in there and another piece of glass fits in there. And that runs vertically, and that's what keeps the panes oriented. If a window is heavy, they have bars of iron, or now in the new ones, they use aluminum or even titanium because it makes the frame lighter. The frame has an Italian name. It's called the ferramenta, the ironamenta. It's iron, right? It's ferrous. Originally it was iron. Now they're using the modern materials. When we started those 2 windows, we had to abide by, and you've heard us talk about this, standards and guidelines for the conservation of historic places in Canada. That meant that we just couldn't go at the restoration of the windows bang, bang, bang. We had 2 experts here. We had Eve, I think her name is Eve Gagnon from Toronto, who's an expert in stained glass, and worked with Brendan Blackmore to make sure his restoration processes were good. And they had to figure out a more sustainable way of attaching the stained glass to this building. Right now, most of those bars in the windows, if I can go back and just find a window, yeah, most of those bars, you don't see it, but they're actually, at the end of them, the iron bar is flattened, there's a hole, and they've screwed them in to the green wooden arch-shaped surrounds of each window. That's not sturdy enough to hold hundreds and hundreds of pounds of lead and glass. So there was a second expert brought in named Tom Morrison from a company named Heritage Standing in Fredericton. And Tom wasn't interested in the stained glass. He had to figure out, how do we hang the stained glass from this basilica? He wanted me to take him up in the towers. So up we went into the towers. He wanted to see how these arches were built. These walls, at the height of the windows, are about 23, 24 inches thick. That's the piers, the pillars between. That's stone, that's granite. What you see outside is plaster here, but they're about 24 inches thick. So to mount and hang these windows, they drilled into the mortar joints and anchored with titanium bolts this new ferramenta so that the windows are now hanging from the basilica itself rather than from the green wooden frame around. Finally, we realized a lot of the damage in this building was caused by temperature differences between what's inside here at 65, 70 degrees, and in February could be as low as minus 20, even more Celsius. That vast temperature difference of maybe 30, 35, 40 degrees is enough to cause something called thermal shock to a stained glass window. You heard Anne talk about it. What is thermal shock? In its worst instance, they were terrified of this in Notre Dame in Paris when that cathedral burned. They were afraid the firefighters, with a fire burning in the attic, were going to go in with hoses and spray the stained glass windows, and all that beautiful medieval glass was going to explode because it was boiling with heat, and then it had suddenly shrunk. That can happen quickly, but it also happens around here if there's a big gap between the temperature on the inside of the building and the temperature on the outside of the building. So when you lose the storm windows outside, or when they become leaky and there's a gap, our storm windows outside are rotting, right? When there's a gap, then the temperature difference is very great between the inside wall and the outside. So we've had some windows actually delaminate. To tell you the full story about stained glass windows pretty quickly, they ain't just stained glass. They're not just blue or red or yellow. They're stained and painted. And then sometimes if they're cracked, they'll put a thin layer of glass on each side and put that back into the kiln to fire it again, and then they'll mount it in a thicker piece of caming. So that's the caming. Sometimes they'll make it thicker to accommodate the thicker glass. And then, of course, that additional weight has to be supported by appropriate ferramenta. So it's a tricky and very carefully crafted kind of a thing. We got the windows down. Bren Blackmore restored them, and Eve and Tom had a good look at them. Eve and Tom didn't actually come back when they were put back. They were happy with what they saw because they had actually gone over to Paris to work on Notre Dame Cathedral's restoration. So we have the UNESCO World Heritage type experts involved in giving advice for what to do. These are exceptionally important historical works of art. There's nothing like them in the rest of North America.
So the plan is that we'll do the windows one by one. So COVID has really done a number on any ability to do fundraising. So we're going to restart our fundraising efforts. 10 of the windows have been restored. In the current restoration project, we've got 2 upper and 4 lower done. And it's just to raise the money and do the windows one by one as we get the money.
We've also taken steps to approach the federal government, and we've also made joint proposals with our sister churches in the ecclesiastical district, being the Anglican Cathedral, Gower Street United, and the Kirk, who also have restoration issues with their buildings. So we're not just the Basilica National Historic Site, we're the Ecclesiastical District National Historic Site. So that approach is being taken on a number of fronts. So the work continues. The other thing to tell you is, without in any way reflecting on what may be going on in the church in Newfoundland and Labrador at the moment, this is a National Historic Site. It's designated by the Governor General in Council, the federal government, on the advice of the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada. This building retains that designation regardless of its owner. You can sell a National Historic Site, but if they were to try to demolish or destroy the authenticity, you can expect there would be some considerable concern. I don't know what the future will hold for this building, but I know National Historic Site status will remain. And just like other ones, it will remain a provincial historic site, a landmark status provincial historic site, it will remain a municipal historic site, and it will remain as part of the ecclesiastical district. We've had a lot of discussion with our partners in the other denominations, and as well as we've started having discussions with the presentation of Mercy Sisters, we do see quite a future for preserving these buildings. They're the most exceptional collections of artwork, and we haven't even talked to you about the neoclassical statuary in here, but there is a future. And by the way, there's also quite a history, and they're not going to disappear on us.
Do you have any other questions? Feel like the auctioneer now, going once.
One last comment. We do have some cookies and some tea if people would like to avail, and we can dispense that with tongs and masks and appropriate things if you wish to stay around. And we're also down at the back desk.
Yeah, so if you'd like to come down and take a look at some of the replicas of the stained glass windows that we have available for sale, or any of the books, just come on down and meet us at the back desk. But we do want to say thank you again, and we do want to make a plea too that if you see it in as a possibility, if you'd be able to make some contribution to the restoration of the windows, we'd gratefully receive that, and it will be put to good use for repairing the rest of and restoring the rest of our stained glass windows. I think when you think about a building like this, I always think about it like a storybook, that it was built to tell the stories of our history and our faith to people who couldn't read or write necessarily. And so when they come into this building, they're surrounded by stories that would teach them about God, about the saints, about who they are and whose they are. And we would like to be able to keep on interpreting our basilica in that same spirit. So thank you.
Thank you for coming out, everyone, on a cold, dark night.
A bit of fun.
First time we've tried this, right? That was John's idea.
John is the author.
No.
Thank you.